Instantly, Madame Dorothea pounced on the cup and stared into it intently, a line appearing between her penciled eyebrows. "What?" Clary said nervously. "Did I crack the cup or something?" "She's reading your tea leaves," Jace said, sounding bored, but he leaned forward along with Clary as Dorothea turned the cup around and around in her thick fingers, scowling. "Is it bad?" Clary asked. "It is neither bad nor good. It is confusing." Dorothea looked at Jace. "Give me your cup," she commanded. Jace looked affronted. "But I'm not done with my—" The old woman snatched the cup out of his hand and splashed the excess tea back into the pot. Frowning, she gazed at what remained. "I see violence in your future, a great deal of blood shed by you and others. You'll fall in love with the wrong person. Also, you have an enemy." "Only one? That's good news." Jace leaned back in his chair as Dorothea put down his cup and picked up Clary's again. She shook her head. "There is nothing for me to read here. The images are jumbled, meaningless." She glanced at Clary. "Is there a block in your mind?" Clary was puzzled. "A what?" "Like a spell that might conceal a memory, or might have blocked out your sight." Clary shook her head. "No, of course not." Jace leaned forward alertly. "Don't be so hasty," he said. "It's true that she claims not to remember ever having had the sight before this week." Maybe I'm just a late developer," Clary snapped. "And don't leer at me, just because I said that." Jace assumed an injured air. "I wasn't going to." "You were working up to a leer, I could tell." "Maybe," Jace acknowledged, "but that doesn't mean I'm not right. Something's blocking your memories, I'm almost sure of it." "Very well, let's try something else." Dorothea put the cup down and reached for the silk-wrapped tarot cards. She fanned the cards and held them out to Clary. "Slide your hand over these until you touch one that feels hot or cold, or seems to cling to your fingers. Then draw that one and show it to me." Obediently, Clary ran her fingers over the cards. They felt cool to the touch and slippery, but none seemed particularly warm or cold, and none stuck to her fingers. Finally, she selected one at random and held it up. "The Ace of Cups," Dorothea said, sounding bemused. "The love card." Clary turned it over and looked at it. The card was heavy in her hand, the image on the front thick with real paint. It showed a hand holding up a cup in front of a rayed sun painted with gilt. The cup was made of gold, engraved with a pattern of smaller suns and studded with rubies. The style of the artwork was as familiar to her as her own breath. "This is a good card, right?" "Not necessarily. The most terrible things men do, they do in the name of love," said Madame Dorothea, her eyes gleaming. "But it is a powerful card." "What does it mean to you?" "That my mother painted it," said Clary, and dropped the card onto the table. "She did, didn't she?" Dorothea nodded, a look of pleased satisfaction on her face. "She painted the whole pack." "A gift for me." "So you say." Jace stood up, his eyes cold. "How well did you know Clary's mother?" Clary craned her head to look up at him. "Jace, you don't have to." Dorothea sat back in her chair, the cards fanned out across her wide chest. "Jocelyn knew what I was, and I knew what she was. We didn't talk about it much. Sometimes she did favors for me, like painting this pack of cards, and in return, I'd tell her the occasional piece of downworld gossip. There was a name she asked me to keep an ear out for, and I did." Jace's expression was unreadable. "What name was that?" "Valentine." Clary sat straight up in her chair. "But that's—" "And when you say you knew what Jocelyn was, what do you mean?" "What was she?" Jace asked. "Jocelyn was what she was," said Dorothea. "But in her past, she'd been like you. A Shadowhunter. One of the Clave." "No," Clary whispered. Dorothea looked at her with sad, almost kindly eyes. "It's true. She chose to live in this house precisely because Because this is a sanctuary, Jace said to Dorothea. Isn't it? Your mother was a control. She made the space, hidden and protected. It's a perfect spot for downworlders on the run to hide out. That's what you do, isn't it? You hide criminals here. You would call them that, Dorothea said. You're familiar with the motto of the Covenant? Said Lex Dura Lex, said Jace automatically. The law is hard, but it is the law. Sometimes the law is too hard. I know the Clave would have taken me away from my mother if they could. You want me to let them do the same to others? So you're a philanthropist. Jace's lip curled. I suppose you expect me to believe that downworlders don't pay you handsomely for the privilege of your sanctuary? Dorothea grinned, wide enough to show a flash of gold molars. We can't all get by on our looks like you. In essence, that door can take you anywhere in this dimension that you want to go. It's an escape hatch, Jace said. That's why your mother wanted to live here. So she could always flee at a moment's notice. Then why didn't she? Clary began, then broke off, suddenly horrified. Because of me, she said. She wouldn't leave without me that night. So she stayed. Jace shook his head. You can't blame yourself. Feeling tears gather under her eyelids, Clary pushed past Jace to the door. I want to see where she would have gone, she said, reaching for the door. I want to see where she was going to escape to. Clary, no. Jace reached for her, but her fingers had already closed around the knob. It spun rapidly under her hand, the door flying open as if she'd pushed it. Dorothea lumbered to her feet with a cry, but it was too late. Before she could even finish her sentence, Clary found herself flung forward, tumbling through empty space. 8. Weapon of choice. She was too surprised to scream. The sensation of falling was the worst part. Her heart flew up into her throat and her stomach turned to water. She flung her hands out, trying to catch at something, anything, that might slow her descent. Her hands closed on branches. Leaves tore off in her grip. She thumped to the ground, hard, her hip and shoulder striking packed earth. She rolled over, sucking the air back into her lungs. She was just beginning to sit up when someone landed on top of her. She was knocked backward. A forehead banged against hers, her knees colliding with someone else's. Tangled up in arms and legs, Clary coughed hair, not her own, out of her mouth and tried to struggle out from under the weight pressing her flat. Ouch, Jace said in her ear, his tone indignant. You elbowed me. Well, you landed on me. He levered himself up on his arms and looked down at her placidly. Clary could see blue sky above his head, a bit of tree branch, and the corner of a gray-clapboard house. Well, you didn't leave me much choice, did you? He asked. Not after you decided to leap merrily through that portal like you were jumping the F-train. You're just lucky it didn't dump us out in the East River. You didn't have to come after me. Yes, I did, he said. You're far too inexperienced to protect yourself in a hostile situation without me. That's sweet. Maybe I'll forgive you. Forgive me? For what? For telling me to shut up. His eyes narrowed. I did not. Well, I did, but you were. Never mind. Her arm, pinned under her back, was beginning to cramp. Rolling to the side to free it, she saw the brown grass of a dead lawn, a chain-link fence, and more of the gray-clubbered house, now distressingly familiar. She froze. I know where we are. Jace stopped spluttering. What? This is Luke's house. She sat up, pitching Jace to the side. He rolled gracefully to his feet and held out a hand to help her up. She ignored him and scrambled upright, shaking out her numb arm. They stood in front of a small gray row house, nestled among the others that lined the Williamsburg waterfront. A breeze blew off the East River, setting a small sign swinging over the brick front steps. Clary watched as Jace read the block-lettered words aloud. Garraway Books. Fine used, new, and out of print. Closed Saturdays. He glanced at the dark front door, its knob wound with a heavy padlock. A few days' worth of mail lay on the doormat, untouched. He looked at Clary. He lives in a bookstore? He lives behind the store. Clary glanced up and down the empty street, bordered on one end by the arched span of the Williamsburg Bridge and on the other by a deserted sugar factory. Across the sluggishly moving river, the sun was setting behind the skyscrapers of lower Manhattan, outlining them in gold. "Jace, how did we get here?" "Through the portal," Jace said, examining the padlock. "It takes you to whatever place you're thinking of." "But I wasn't thinking of here," Clary objected. "I wasn't thinking of anywhere." "You must have been." He dropped the subject, seemingly uninterested. "So, since we're here anyway." "Yeah. What do you want to do?" "Leave, I guess," Clary said bitterly. "Luke told me not to come here." Jace shook his head. "And you just accept that?" Clary hugged her arms around herself. Despite the fading heat of the day, she felt cold. "Do I have a choice?" "We always have choices," Jace said. "If I were you, I'd be pretty curious about Luke right now." "Do you have keys to the house?" Clary shook her head. "No, but sometimes he leaves the back door unlocked." She pointed to the narrow alley between Luke's row house and the next. Plastic trash cans were propped in a neat row beside stacks of folded newspapers and a plastic tub of empty soda bottles. At least Luke was still a responsible recycler. "You sure he isn't home?" Jace asked. She glanced at the empty curb. "Well, his truck's gone, the store's closed, and all the lights are off." "I'd say probably not." "Then lead the way." The narrow aisle between the row houses ended at a high chain-link fence, enclosing Luke's small backyard. The only plants thriving were the weeds pushing through the paving stones, cracking them into powdery shards. "Up and over," Jace said, wedging the toe of his boot into a gap in the fence. The metal rattled loudly as he climbed, making Clary glance around nervously, but the neighboring house remained dark. Jace cleared the top and jumped down, straight into the bushes. An ear-splitting yell erupted. For a moment, Clary thought he had landed on a stray cat. She heard Jace yell in surprise and fall backward. Then, a dark shadow, far too big to be feline, shot out of the bushes and bolted across the yard, keeping low. Jace rolled to his feet and darted after it, looking furious. Clary started to climb. Swinging her leg over the top, Isabelle's borrowed jeans snagged on a twist of wire, tearing up the side. She dropped to the ground, her shoes scuffing the dirt, just as Jace cried out in triumph. "Got him!" Clary turned to see Jace sitting on top of the intruder, pinning his arms above his head. Jace grabbed for the figure's wrist. "Let's see your face." "Get the hell off me, you pretentious asshole," the intruder snarled, shoving at Jace. Struggling halfway upright, his battered glasses knocked askew, the boy glared up at them. Clary froze. "Simon?" Jace groaned. "Oh, great. And here I was hoping I'd caught something interesting." There was an intent look on Simon's face. "And there are vampires too? Werewolves, warlocks, all that stuff?" Clary gnawed her lower lip. "So I hear. And you kill them too?" Simon asked, directing the question to Jace, who had put the steel back in his pocket and was now examining his flawless nails for defects. "Only when they've been naughty." For a moment, Simon merely sat and stared down at his feet. Clary wondered if burdening him with this kind of information had been the wrong thing to do. He had a stronger practical streak than almost anyone else she knew. He might hate knowing something like this, something for which there was no logical explanation. She leaned forward anxiously, just as Simon lifted his head. "That is so awesome," he said. Jace looked as startled as Clary felt. "Awesome?" Simon nodded enthusiastically, making the dark curls bounce on his forehead. "Totally. It's like Dungeons and Dragons, but real." Jace was looking at Simon as if he were some bizarre species of insect. "It's like what?" "It's a game," Clary explained, feeling vaguely embarrassed. People pretend to be wizards and elves, and they kill monsters and stuff. Jace looked stupefied. Simon grinned. You've never heard of Dungeons and Dragons? I've heard of dungeons, Jace said. Also dragons. Although they're mostly extinct. Simon looked disappointed. You've never killed a dragon? He's probably never met a 6-foot-tall hot elf woman in a fur bikini either, Clary said irritably. Lay off, Simon. Real elves are about 8 inches tall, Jace pointed out. Also, they bite. But vampires are hot, right? Simon asked. I mean, some of the vampires are babes, aren't they? Clary worried for a moment that Jace might lunge across the porch and throttle Simon senseless. Instead, he considered the question. Some of them, maybe. Awesome, Simon repeated. Clary decided she had preferred it when they were fighting. Jace slid off the porch railing. So, are we going to search the house or not? Simon scrambled to his feet. I'm game. What are we looking for? We? Jace said, his tone dripping with sinister delicacy. I don't remember inviting you along. Jace, Clary said angrily. The left corner of his mouth curled up. Just joking. He stepped aside, leaving her a clear path to the door. Shall we? Clary fumbled for the doorknob in the dark. As it opened, the porch light flicked on, illuminating the entryway. The door leading into the bookstore was closed. She jiggled the knob. It's locked. Allow me, mundanes, Jace said, setting her gently aside. He pulled the steel from his pocket and pressed it to the door. Simon watched with some resentment. No amount of vampire babes, Clary suspected, was ever going to make him like Jace. He's a piece of work, isn't he? Simon muttered. How do you stand him? He saved my life. Simon glanced at her quickly. How? With a soft click, the door swung open. Here we go, Jace said, sliding his steel back into his pocket. Clary noticed the mark on the door, just over his head, fade as they stepped inside. The back door led into a small storage room, the bare walls peeling paint. Cardboard boxes were stacked everywhere, their contents identified with marker scrawls: fiction, poetry, cooking, local interest, romance. The apartment's through there, Clary said, heading toward the door at the far end of the room. Jace caught her arm. Wait. She looked at him nervously. Is something wrong? I don't know. He edged between 2 narrow stacks of boxes, then whistled. Clary, you might want to come over here and see this. She glanced around. The room was dim, the only illumination coming from the porch light filtering through the window. It's so dark. Suddenly, light flared up, bathing the room in a brilliant glow. Simon turned his head aside, blinking. Ouch. Jace chuckled. Standing on top of a sealed box, he raised his hand, something glowing between his fingers. Witch light, he said. Simon muttered something under his breath. Clary was already clambering through the boxes, pushing her way toward Jace. He stood behind a teetering pile of mysteries, the eerie glow from the witch light casting sharp shadows over his face. Look at that, he said, pointing higher up on the wall. At first, she thought he was indicating a pair of ornamental sconces. But as her eyes adjusted, she realized they were actually loops of metal attached to short chains, their ends sunk deep into the wall. Are those? Manacles, Simon said, picking his way through the boxes. That's, Don't say kinky, Clary warned. This is Luke we're talking about. Jace reached up, running his hand along the inside of one of the metal loops. When he lowered it, his fingers were dusted with a red-brown powder. Blood. And look. He pointed to the wall around the chains. The plaster bulged outward. Someone tried to yank these things out of the wall. Tried pretty hard, from the looks of it. Clary's heart pounded hard inside her chest. Do you think Luke is all right? Jace lowered the witch light. I think we'd better find out. The door to the apartment was unlocked. It led into Luke's living room. Despite the hundreds of books in the store, there were even more here. Bookshelves stretched to the ceiling, the volumes stacked in double rows, one row blocking another. Most were poetry and fiction, with plenty of fantasy and mystery thrown in. Clary remembered plowing through the Chronicles of Prydain here, curled up in Luke's window seat as the sun went down over the East River. "I think he's still around," Simon called from the kitchenette. "The percolator's on, and there's coffee. Still hot." Clary peered around the kitchen door. Dishes were stacked in the sink, and Luke's jackets hung neatly on hooks inside the coat closet. Walking down the hallway, she opened the door to his small bedroom. It looked the same as ever, the bed with its gray coverlet and flat pillows unmade, the top of the bureau scattered with loose change. She turned away. Some part of her had been absolutely certain that when they walked in, they'd find the place torn apart, with Luke tied up, injured, or worse. Now, she didn't know what to think. Numbly, she crossed the hall to the little guest bedroom where she had often stayed when her mother was out of town on business. She and Luke would stay up late, watching old horror movies on the flickering black and white TV. She even kept a backpack full of extra things here, so she didn't have to lug her stuff back and forth from home. Kneeling down, she tugged it out from under the bed by its olive green strap. It was covered with buttons, most of which Simon had given her. Gamers do it better, otaku wench, still not king. Inside were some folded clothes, a few spare pairs of underwear, a hairbrush, even shampoo. Thank God, she thought, kicking the bedroom door closed. Quickly, she changed, stripping off Isabelle's too big, now grass-stained and sweaty clothes, and pulling on a pair of her own sandblasted cords, soft as worn paper, along with a blue tank top with a design of Chinese characters across the front. Tossing Isabelle's clothes into her backpack, she yanked the cord shut and left the bedroom, the pack bouncing familiarly between her shoulder blades. It was nice to have something of her own again. She found Jace in Luke's book-lined office, examining a green duffel bag that lay unzipped across the desk. It was, as Simon had said, full of weapons, sheath knives, a coiled whip, and something that looked like a razor-edged metal disc. "It's a chakram," Jace said, looking up as Clary entered the room. "A Sikh weapon. You whirl it around your index finger before releasing it. They're rare and hard to use. Strange that Luke would have one. They used to be Hodge's weapon of choice, back in the day. Or so he tells me. Luke collects stuff. Art objects, you know," Clary replied, indicating the shelf behind the desk, lined with bronze Indian and Russian idols. Her favorite was a statuette of the Indian goddess of destruction, Kali, brandishing a sword and a severed head as she danced, her head thrown back and her eyes slitted closed. To the side of the desk stood an antique Chinese screen, carved from glowing rosewood. Pretty things. Jace moved the chakram aside gingerly. A handful of clothes spilled out of the untied end of Luke's duffel bag, as if they had been an afterthought. "I think this is yours, by the way." He pulled out a rectangular object hidden among the clothes, a wooden-framed photograph with a long vertical crack running through the glass. The break sent a network of spidery lines across the smiling faces of Clary, Luke, and her mother. "That is mine," Clary said, taking it from his hand. "It's cracked," Jace observed. "I know. I did that, I smashed it. When I threw it at the Ravener demon." She looked at him, seeing the realization dawn on his face. "That means Luke's been back to the apartment since the attack. Maybe even today." "He must have been the last person to come through the portal," Jace said. "That's why it took us here. You weren't thinking of anything, so it sent us to the last place it had been." "Nice of Dorothea to tell us he was there," Clary muttered. "He probably paid her off to be quiet. Either that, or she trusts him more than she trusts us. Which means he might not be." "Guys!" Simon burst into the office, panic in his voice. "Someone's coming." Clary dropped the photo. "Is it Luke?" Simon peered back down the hall, then nodded. "It is. But he's not alone, there are two men with him." "Men?" Jace crossed the room in a few strides, peered through the door, and spat a curse under his breath. "Warlocks." Clary stared. Warlocks? But... Shaking his head, Jace backed away from the door. Is there another way out of here? A back door? Clary shook her head, her heartbeat quickening as the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway, striking pangs of fear into her chest. Jace's eyes darted around the room, landing on the rosewood screen. Get behind that, he commanded. Now. Clary dropped the fractured photo on the desk and slipped behind the screen, pulling Simon with her. Jace was right behind them, his steel in hand. They had barely concealed themselves when the door swung open, and footsteps echoed into Luke's office. Voices followed, 3 men speaking. Clary glanced nervously at Simon, who had gone pale, then at Jace, who had raised the steel and was moving its tip lightly in a square shape across the back of the screen. As Clary stared, the square turned clear, like a pane of glass. She heard Simon suck in his breath, a tiny, barely audible sound. Jace shook his head at them both, mouthing words, "They can't see us through it, but we can see them." Biting her lip, Clary moved to the edge of the square and peered through, conscious of Simon breathing down her neck. She could see everything, the bookshelves, the desk with the duffel bag thrown across it, and Luke, ragged-looking and slightly stooped, his glasses pushed up to the top of his head, standing near the door. It was frightening, even though she knew he couldn't see her. The window Jace had created worked like the glass in a police station interrogation room, strictly one way. Luke turned, looking back through the doorway. "Yes, feel free to look around," he said, his tone heavy with sarcasm. "Nice of you to show such an interest." A low chuckle sounded from the corner of the office. With an impatient flick of the wrist, Jace tapped the frame of his window, expanding it wider to reveal more of the room. 2 men stood with Luke, both clad in long, reddish robes, their hoods pushed back. One was thin, with an elegant gray mustache and pointed beard. When he smiled, his blindingly white teeth looked unnaturally sharp, as if they had been filed to cannibalistic points. The other was burly, thick-set like a wrestler, with close-cropped reddish hair. His skin was dark purple, stretched tight over his cheekbones, almost shining. "Those are warlocks?" Clary whispered softly. Jace didn't answer. He had gone rigid, stiff as iron. "He's afraid I'll make a run for it, try to get to Luke," Clary thought. She wished she could reassure him that she wouldn't. There was something about those 2 men, in their thick cloaks the color of arterial blood, that was utterly terrifying. "Consider this a friendly follow-up, Greymark," said the man with the gray mustache, his voice smooth yet menacing. His smile widened, showing those razor-sharp teeth. "There's nothing friendly about you, Pangborn," Luke replied, sitting on the edge of his desk. He angled his body slightly, blocking the men's view of his duffel bag and its contents. Now that he was closer, Clary could see the bruises on his face and hands, his fingers scraped and bloody. A long cut along his neck disappeared down into his collar. What on earth happened to him? "Blackwell, don't touch that, it's valuable," Luke said sternly.